The floorboards didn't just creak. They screamed as Hannah drove the rusted crowbar into the rotting oak. Her hands were blistered, bleeding from hours of desperate labor, but she couldn't stop. Below the stage of the abandoned Starlight Pavilion, a hollow echo mocked her every strike. When the ancient wood finally splintered and gave way, a blast of stale, freezing air rushed up from the darkness, carrying a scent that made her stomach drop. Old paper, copper, and damp earth. She had bought this decaying ruin for $10 just to have a roof over her head. But as her flashlight pierced the black void beneath the stage, Hannah realized her life of running was over. She hadn't just bought a dance hall. She had bought a grave of secrets. At 19, the world was supposed to be opening up. For Hannah Jenkins, it had violently slammed shut, locking her out in the freezing rain of coastal Maine. She had been living in her 1998 Ford Escort for 3 weeks. The heater had died on day 4, leaving her to endure the brutal, creeping damp of November in a town that felt like it was actively trying to freeze her to death. Blackwood Cove was a dying fishing village, the kind of place people only left, never arrived at. Hannah had arrived here purely by accident. Her transmission had started grinding ominously on Route 1, and she had pulled off just in time for the car to completely die behind a boarded-up diner. Her current reality was a stark contrast to the life she had envisioned just a month ago. Hannah had been working 2 jobs in Boston, saving every penny in a joint account with her fiancé, David. They were supposed to sign a lease on a small apartment. Instead, Hannah woke up one morning to find the apartment empty, David gone, and their bank account drained to a balance of negative $14. Her stepmother, a woman who had tolerated Hannah's existence only while Hannah's father was alive, immediately changed the locks on her childhood home. Now her entire net worth consisted of a half-empty bag of pretzels, a thin wool blanket, and exactly $12.50 in crumpled cash stuffed in her coat pocket. The night the nor'easter hit, Hannah knew she wouldn't survive in the car. The wind was howling off the Atlantic, shaking the little Ford so violently she thought it would roll. Ice was forming on the inside of the windshield. Desperate, she shoved her cash into her pocket, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and forced her way out into the blinding sleet. She trudged down Main Street, looking for an unlocked door, a 24-hour laundromat, an ATM vestibule. Anything. But Blackwood Cove rolled up its sidewalks at 6 p.m. The only light spilling onto the slick pavement came from the basement windows of the town hall. Hannah slipped through the heavy oak doors, relishing the blast of radiator heat. She crept down the stairs, intending to hide in a bathroom until morning. But as she rounded the corner, she stumbled right into the back of a small, sparsely populated room. About 20 older locals sat in folding chairs. At the front stood Silas Abernathy, the town clerk, a man whose face looked like a topographic map of a hard life, holding a wooden gavel. It was a tax foreclosure auction. Hannah shrank against the back wall, trying to remain invisible while soaking up the warmth. Silas was droning on, listing properties that had been abandoned for decades. Parcels of useless swampland went for a few $100s to bored-looking locals. "All right, last item," Silas grumbled, adjusting his thick spectacles. "Parcel 402, the Starlight Pavilion. Owed back taxes, $42,000. The town has seized the deed. We're looking to offload the liability. Starting bid is $1,000. Who wants the land?" Silence fell over the room. Several people scoffed. "Silas, that place is a death trap," a man in the second row called out. "Roof's caved in. Foundation is sinking into the bluff. It'd cost $50,000 just to demolish it safely." "The land is zoned commercial, Harold," Silas argued weakly. "The land is falling into the ocean," Harold shot back. Silas sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, the town insurance policy is doubling next month just because that hazard is sitting on our books. We need it gone. $500. Silence. $100. More silence. The locals began putting on their coats. They all knew the Starlight Pavilion. Built in the 1920s by a wealthy bootlegger named Thomas Sterling, It had been a glamorous dance hall and speakeasy, but Sterling vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1932, and the pavilion had been shuttered ever since, left to rot on the jagged cliffs at the edge of town. It was universally considered an eyesore, and by some of the more superstitious locals, cursed. "Anybody," Silas pleaded. "Just take the deed. Assume the property. The town will waive the back taxes entirely. Just take the liability off our hands. $10. Do I hear $10 for the deed to the Starlight Pavilion?" Hannah's hand moved before her brain could stop it. She didn't know anything about property taxes, structural liabilities, or zoning laws. All she heard was that for $10, she could legally own a building with walls and a roof. A place where the police couldn't tell her she was trespassing. A place she couldn't be evicted from by a cruel stepmother or a cheating fiancé. "I'll take it," Hannah croaked, her voice raspy from the cold. Every head in the room swiveled to stare at the dishevelled, shivering teenage girl standing in the shadows. Silas Abernathy squinted, leaning over his podium. "You?" Silas asked, disbelief colouring his tone. "Are you of legal age, miss?" "I'm 19, Hannah said, stepping forward into the fluorescent light. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a $10 bill, smoothing the wrinkles. "I have the $10. A heavy silence hung in the room. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room burst open, letting in a swirl of snow. A man in a tailored camel hair coat stomped in, shaking the ice from his shoulders. This was Adrian Cole, the only man in Blackwood Cove who possessed actual wealth, earned by buying up desperate people's properties for pennies and flipping them to out-of-state developers. "Sorry I'm late, Silas," Adrian barked, striding down the aisle. "Got stuck behind a plough. I'm here for the Starlight parcel. I'll give you $50 for it." Silas cleared his throat nervously. Adrian was not a man you crossed in this town. "I'm sorry, Adrian. You're too late. The gavel was just about to fall. The young lady bought it." Adrian stopped dead, turning to look at Hannah. His eyes raked over her wet, dirty clothes, her cheap boots, and the $10 bill in her trembling hand. A sneer curled his lip. "Her? She looks like a vagrant," Adrian scoffed. "Silas, don't be ridiculous. She can't afford the demolition costs. Sell it to me, $100. "It's a public auction, Mr. Cole," Silas said, standing a little taller. "She met the asking price. By law, the bid is hers." He slammed the gavel down. "Sold. To the young lady in the back for $10. Adrian's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He stepped into Hannah's personal space, towering over her. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. "You have no idea what you just did, little girl," Adrian whispered, his voice low and venomous. "You just bought yourself a nightmare. You won't last a week in that rotting coffin. When you come crawling back to sell it, I'll give you $5. He turned and stormed out of the hall. Hannah stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She walked up to Silas's desk, handed over her $10 bill, and signed the paperwork with a hand that shook so badly she could barely read her own name. Silas handed her a heavy, rusted brass key. "Be careful out there, Hannah. The bluff is unstable, and the building, well, it's got a lot of history. Not all of it good." Hannah took the key. It felt heavy and cold in her palm. For the first time in her life, she was a homeowner. The storm broke by morning, leaving Blackwood Cove buried under a foot of heavy, wet snow. Hannah trudged the 2 miles out to the edge of town, the deed folded securely in her inner pocket. When the Starlight Pavilion finally loomed into view through the skeletal trees, Hannah's breath caught in her throat. It was massive, and it was terrifying. Perched precariously on a jagged cliff overlooking the churning grey Atlantic, the pavilion was a sprawling 3-story behemoth of rotting wood and shattered glass. Its once white exterior was now the colour of bruised slate, stripped of paint by decades of salt air. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, and the wraparound porch was missing huge chunks of floorboards, looking like a mouthful of missing teeth. Hannah climbed the front steps, testing each one carefully. She inserted the heavy brass key into the front double doors. The lock was so seized with rust, she had to use her whole body weight to turn it. With a deafening screech, the door gave way. She stepped inside and was immediately swallowed by the shadows. The air inside was freezing, smelling heavily of mildew, sea salt, and ancient dust. But it was dry. As her eyes adjusted, the sheer scale of the interior revealed itself. It was a massive ballroom. High above, two enormous crystal chandeliers, black with grime and draped in thick cobwebs, hung from the vaulted ceiling. A grand double staircase curved up to a wraparound balcony, and at the far end of the room stood the stage, a grand elevated platform framed by the tattered, moth-eaten remains of heavy velvet curtains. It was a beautiful ruin, but it was hers. Hannah immediately got to work. She couldn't heat the massive ballroom, so she chose the old box office ticket booth in the front lobby as her living quarters. It was a tiny, enclosed space, barely 8 feet square, with thick glass that kept the drafts out. She dragged in her blanket, her spare clothes, and a few cushions she salvaged from mouldy chairs in the lobby. For the next 3 days, Hannah survived by scavenging. She found a rusted but functional cast-iron wood stove in the basement kitchen. It took her hours of agonizing labor to drag it up the stairs and install it in the lobby, venting the pipe out of a broken window. She spent her days pulling dry, splintered wood from the collapsed sections of the eastern wing to use as firewood. She melted snow in an old copper pot she found to drink. She was starving, rationing her pretzels, but she was warm. On the 4th day, trouble arrived. Hannah was sweeping dust from the lobby when she heard the crunch of tires on snow. She looked out the shattered window to see Adrian Cole's sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulling up to the front steps. Adrian got out, accompanied by a burly man in a hard hat carrying a clipboard. Hannah gripped her broom handle tightly and stepped out onto the porch. "Well, well," Adrian called out, his boots crunching loudly. "Still breathing, I see. Hannah, isn't it? I brought Gary here from the county zoning office, just doing a little wellness check." Gary, the zoning official, looked uncomfortable. He avoided Hannah's gaze, scribbling on his clipboard. "Miss, this structure has been condemned since 1985. It's not zoned for residential living. There's no running water, no electricity, and the structural integrity is severely compromised." "I own the deed," Hannah said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her knees were knocking together. "I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm just cleaning it up." "Cleaning it up?" Adrian laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're living in squalor. Gary here is going to write up a report. You'll be hit with daily fines for code violations. Fines you can't pay. In a month, the county will seize the property right back, and I'll buy it at the next auction. Save yourself the legal trouble, kid. I'll give you $500 for the deed right now. You can take a bus back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of." Hannah looked at Adrian. She saw the intense, predatory hunger in his eyes. He didn't just want this land. He was desperate for it. Why? The land was unstable. The building was worthless. Why was a millionaire developer spending his time bullying a homeless teenager over a rotting dance hall? "No," Hannah said, lifting her chin. Adrian's smile vanished. "Excuse me?" "I said no. The answer is no. I'm not selling. Get off my property, Mr. Cole." Adrian's jaw tightened. He took a menacing step up the stairs, but Hannah didn't flinch. She had survived David's betrayal. She had survived the freezing streets. She wasn't going to be intimidated by a small-town bully in a cashmere coat. "You're making a massive mistake," Adrian hissed. "You think you're safe in here. This place is a death trap. Don't come crying to me when the roof caves in on your head." He turned to Gary. "Write her up for every violation in the book. I want her out by Friday." As they drove away, Hannah leaned against the rotting doorframe, her heart pounding. The bravado faded, leaving behind a cold knot of panic. Adrian was right. She couldn't afford fines. She had no money, no food, and winter was only just beginning. She walked back into the massive, silent ballroom. The shadows seemed longer now, more oppressive. As she stared at the giant, elevated stage at the far end of the room, a strange thought occurred to her. If Adrian Cole wanted this place so badly, maybe he knew something she didn't. Driven by a mix of paranoia and burning curiosity, Hannah began to truly explore the Starlight Pavilion. She spent hours mapping the massive structure. There were dressing rooms behind the stage, their vanity mirrors shattered, old feather bows reduced to dust. There was a sweeping balcony with private viewing boxes. And there was the basement, a sprawling labyrinth of storage rooms and a massive commercial kitchen. But it was the stage itself that continually drew her attention. It was built differently from the rest of the structure. While the dance floor was made of standard maple, warped and water damaged, the stage was elevated nearly 4 feet off the ground and constructed of thick, heavy oak planks. When she walked across the ballroom floor, her footsteps echoed normally. But when she climbed onto the stage and stomped her boot, the sound was entirely different. It didn't sound like she was stomping over a standard crawl space. It sounded resonant, deep, like a massive empty drum. Hannah knelt, brushing away decades of dust. The oak floorboards of the stage were tightly fitted, but she noticed something odd near the center, right where the lead singer of a big band would have stood. The nails in a 3 by 3 foot section weren't standard iron nails like the rest of the floor. They were heavy, flat-headed steel bolts, rusted dark brown, blending in perfectly with the dark oak. Her pulse quickened. Why bolt down a specific section of the stage floor? Hannah ran to the basement and retrieved her most valuable tool, a heavy 3-foot steel crowbar she had found in the boiler room. She returned to the stage, her stomach growling violently with hunger, but adrenaline masking the weakness in her limbs. She wedged the forked end of the crowbar into the microscopic seam between the bolted boards and the rest of the stage. She threw her entire body weight against the steel bar. Nothing happened. The wood groaned, but held fast. Hannah cursed, wiping sweat from her forehead, despite the freezing temperature in the room. She repositioned the bar, finding a slightly wider gap where water damage had softened the adjacent wood. She braced her boots against the stage, gripped the cold steel, and pulled with everything she had. Crack. The sound was sharp as a gunshot in the cavernous room. One of the heavy steel bolts ripped free from the joist below, sending a spray of ancient wood splinters into the air. Panting, Hannah wedged the bar deeper and pulled again. The muscles in her back screamed in protest. She had been living on pretzels and snow water for nearly a week. Her vision blurred at the edges, but she refused to stop. With a final agonizing heave, the oak board snapped violently upward. Hannah was thrown backward onto the stage, gasping for breath. She sat up and crawled toward the hole she had just created. The floorboards didn't just cover a crawl space. Beneath the splintered oak was a heavy, industrial-grade steel hatch. Hannah stared at it in disbelief. This wasn't standard 1920s architecture. This was a vault door. It was heavily oxidized, covered in a bloom of orange rust, and secured by a massive, old-fashioned brass padlock the size of her fist. Her mind raced. Thomas Sterling, the man who built the Starlight, was a rumoured bootlegger. Was this where he hid his liquor during Prohibition? But Prohibition ended decades ago. Why would Adrian Cole be so desperate to buy an empty liquor stash? She needed to get the padlock off. Hannah struck the brass lock with her crowbar. The metal clanged loudly, sending a shockwave up her arms, but the lock didn't even dent. She hit it again and again, swinging wildly, frustration and desperation fueling her. Sparks flew as steel met brass. "Come on!" she screamed, her voice echoing into the empty balconies above. She dropped the crowbar and examined the lock closer. The shackle was thick, but the base where it entered the mechanism was heavily corroded by decades of salty sea air seeping through the floorboards. She ran back to her ticket booth room and grabbed a small bottle of penetrating oil she had found in her car's trunk, along with a heavy claw hammer. Returning to the stage, she soaked the rusted joints of the lock in the oil, letting it sit for a few agonizing minutes. Then, she wedged the forked end of the crowbar through the U-shape of the padlock, twisting it to create tension. With her other hand, she brought the heavy claw hammer down onto the base of the lock with a vicious strike. Snap! The rusted internal pins gave way. The heavy brass padlock fell open, thudding heavily against the steel hatch. Hannah threw the lock aside. Her hands were shaking violently. She grabbed the heavy iron ring welded to the center of the hatch. It was stiff, resistant, but as she planted her feet and hauled upward, the hinges let out a horrific shrieking groan. The hatch flipped open, slamming loudly against the stage floor. A rush of air blew up into Hannah's face. She reeled back, coughing. It smelled strongly of ozone, dry earth, and something metallic, like old copper coins. She grabbed her heavy-duty Maglite flashlight, clicking it on. She crept to the edge of the hole and shined the beam down. Instead of a shallow dirt crawl space, the beam of light illuminated a narrow vertical shaft lined with heavily reinforced concrete. A rusted iron ladder was bolted to the wall, descending into absolute pitch blackness. The shaft was deep, much deeper than the basement level she had already explored. Hannah sat back on her heels, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the ballroom. Every instinct screamed at her to close the hatch, to walk away. This was how horror movies started. This was how girls like her disappeared forever. But then she thought of Adrian Cole's smug face. She thought of David's betrayal. She thought of the $12 in her pocket and the eviction notice coming on Friday. She had nowhere else to go. The only way forward was down. Hannah shoved the heavy Maglite into her coat pocket, gripped the freezing iron rungs of the ladder, and swung her legs over the edge. Taking a deep breath of the stale, ancient air, she began her descent into the dark beneath the starlight pavilion. The descent felt endless. Hannah's boots slipped on the freezing, rusted rungs of the iron ladder, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides. The Maglite in her pocket bumped against her hip with every step, casting wild, swinging shadows against the circular concrete walls of the shaft. 30 feet down, then 40. The temperature began to change. The biting, icy chill of the coastal winter faded, replaced by a heavy, insulated dampness. The smell of ozone and wet earth grew so thick it coated the back of her throat. Finally, her boot hit solid ground. Hannah stood at the bottom of the shaft, her breath echoing loudly in the suffocating darkness. She pulled the heavy flashlight from her coat and clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through a thick haze of suspended dust, revealing a narrow tunnel carved directly into the bedrock of the cliffside. The walls were shored up with thick, rotting timber supports, resembling an old coal mine more than a dance hall basement. She moved forward slowly, sweeping the beam side to side. The tunnel sloped downward, leading her deeper underground, closer to the sea. She could actually hear the muffled, rhythmic booming of the Atlantic waves crashing against the cliff face outside. At the end of the 50-foot passage, the tunnel abruptly opened into a sprawling, cavernous room. Hannah gasped, dropping the flashlight beam to the floor before slowly raising it. What she saw defied logic. She wasn't standing in a dirt-floored storage cellar. She was standing in a subterranean palace of 1920s decadence, perfectly preserved in a vacuum of subterranean air. It was a secret high-roller VIP lounge, completely hidden from the authorities above. The floors were covered in what used to be a vibrant Persian rug, now faded and brittle. Rotted leather Chesterfield sofas sat arranged around low mahogany tables. Along the far wall, a gorgeous Art Deco bar, made of polished dark wood, stood untouched, its shelves lined with hundreds of glass bottles that caught the flashlight's beam and scattered it like shattered diamonds. But it wasn't the pristine, untouched liquor stash that made Hannah's blood run cold. It was the desk in the center of the room. And what was sitting behind it? Slumped forward over the heavy oak desk was a human skeleton. Hannah stumbled backward, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The flashlight slipped from her sweaty grip, clattering onto the floor and rolling away, its beam illuminating the macabre scene from the ground up. She scrambled against the rock wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clamped a hand over her mouth, fighting the sudden violent urge to vomit. Panic screamed at her to turn around, to climb back up the ladder and run away from Blackwood Cove forever. "You have $12, a cold, rational voice whispered in her mind. "If you run, you freeze to death in a car. You survived David. You survived the streets. Look at it." Trembling violently, Hannah crept forward and picked up the flashlight. She forced herself to approach the desk. The skeletal remains belonged to a man. He was dressed in a tattered, moth-eaten bespoke suit that was once the height of 1930s fashion. A fedora lay discarded on the floor near his skeletal hand. But the most horrifying detail was the skull. Right in the center of the bone, just above where the left eye would have been, was a clean, round hole. This wasn't an accidental death. This was an execution. "Thomas Sterling," Hannah whispered into the silence. The legendary bootlegger hadn't vanished. He had been murdered and sealed in his own vault. Hannah swallowed hard, her survival instinct finally overriding her terror. If Sterling was killed in his own secret vault, whoever murdered him might have been looking for something. Had they found it? She stepped closer to the desk, trying not to look at the hollow eye sockets staring blankly at the far wall. The desk was covered in a thick layer of dust. Several drawers hung open, empty and ransacked. The murderer had clearly searched the place. But as Hannah shone the light over the skeleton itself, something caught her eye. Clutched tightly in the bony, disjointed fingers of Sterling's right hand, hidden beneath his slumped ribcage, was a heavy gold pocket watch. Hannah hesitated, disgusted by the thought of touching the remains. But the watch was practically glowing in the flashlight beam. Using her pen from her pocket, she gently pried the watch from the skeletal fingers. It was heavy, solid 24-karat gold, engraved with intricate floral patterns. She pressed the clasp. The watch snapped open. The glass face was shattered, the hands frozen eternally at 11:42. But it wasn't the time that caught her attention. Scratched crudely into the gold on the inside of the lid, as if done frantically with a needle or a pocket knife, were 4 numbers, 14-32-08-41. Hannah frowned. A combination. She frantically swept her flashlight around the room. The murderer had emptied the desk, but what if they hadn't found the real prize? What if Sterling had locked it away before they got to him? She scanned the walls behind the desk. They were covered in dark, ornate oak paneling. Hannah began pressing her hands against the wood, knocking gently, listening for a hollow sound. She moved methodically, her fear forgotten in the thrill of the hunt. Near the corner of the room, behind a rotted velvet curtain, her knuckles rapped against the paneling and produced a dull, heavy metallic thud. Hannah wedged her fingers into the seam of the wood and pulled. A false panel swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a massive black iron Mosler wall safe. The dial was pristine, completely protected from the damp air. Her hands shook as she reached for the cold brass dial. The murderer hadn't known about this. They had killed Sterling, ransacked the desk, locked the hatch above, and fled. Hannah took a deep breath and looked at the scratched numbers on the watch. She spun the dial to the right, stopping on 14. Click. Left, past 0, stopping on 32. Click. Right to 08. Click. Left, settling slowly onto 41. A heavy, definitive metallic clunk echoed from inside the thick iron door. Hannah gripped the heavy brass handle, planted her boots, and pulled. The heavy door swung open with a smooth, oiled glide. Hannah shone her flashlight into the safe, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. The safe was massive, the size of a modern refrigerator, and it was packed. On the top shelf sat 3 heavy olive-green canvas bags, the kind used by banks in the early 20th century. Hannah reached out, her fingers trembling, and pulled one toward her. It was incredibly heavy. She untied the rotting drawstrings and tilted it toward the light. A cascade of gleaming silver spilled over the edge of the bag. Hannah gasped. They were Morgan silver dollars, practically uncirculated, dating back to the late 1800s. There had to be thousands of them. Beside the bag sat neatly stacked, tightly banded bricks of paper money. Hannah picked one up. The bills were oversized, featuring intricate artwork. They weren't standard dollars. They were Series 1928 gold certificates. $50 and $100 denominations. "Oh my God," Hannah breathed. The face value alone was staggering, but to a collector, in this pristine condition, she was looking at millions of dollars. But it was the bottom shelf that made her blood run cold. There were no coins or cash here. Instead, there was a small, ornate cedar box, and beside it, a thick, black leather-bound ledger. Hannah pulled the ledger out. The leather was dry and cracked, but intact. She opened it, shining the light on the yellowed pages. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping cursive in dark fountain pen ink. It was Thomas Sterling's master ledger. But it wasn't just a record of bootlegged whiskey sales. It was a diary of corruption. Hannah flipped through the pages, her eyes skimming the entries. Sterling hadn't just been a smuggler. He had been the shadow banker for the entire northeastern seaboard. He held collateral for gambling debts, loans, and illicit favors. She turned to the final pages, dated October 1932. One name dominated the entries, written in heavily underlined strokes: Richard Cole. Hannah's breath hitched in her throat. Adrian Cole's grandfather. She read the frantic, final entries written just days before Sterling's murder. October 12th, 1932. Richard is desperate. His textile mills are failing. He borrowed another $50,000 against his family estate. If he defaults, I own the entire Cole bluff. October 18th, 1932. Cole cannot pay. He came begging for an extension. I refused. I told him I am filing the deed transfers on Monday. I will own everything he has. He threatened me. The man is a coward, but a desperate one. October 21st, 1932. Meeting Richard tonight in the lower lounge. He claims he has the cash to clear his debts. If he tries anything, I have his signed confessions of fraud regarding the Blackwood Cove town charter secured in the safe. If I die, those documents will destroy the Cole name forever. Hannah stared at the faded ink, the pieces of the puzzle violently slamming together in her mind. Richard Cole hadn't brought the money that night in 1932. He had brought a gun. He murdered Thomas Sterling to erase his debts and protect his family's empire. But he hadn't known about the hidden Mosler safe behind the wall panel. He locked the hatch, buried the secret, and went on to build the immense Cole fortune on stolen land and unpaid debts. And Adrian knew. Suddenly, Adrian's desperate obsession with the Starlight Pavilion made terrifying sense. He didn't want to develop the land. He wanted to demolish the building using his own private crew so he could excavate the foundation and find his grandfather's dirty secrets before anyone else did. The unpaid taxes, the condemnation. Adrian had orchestrated it all to keep people away from the property until he could buy it quietly. Hannah Jenkins, a homeless 19-year-old with $10, had accidentally outbid him and bought the skeleton in the Cole family closet. Hannah set the ledger down and reached for the small cedar box. She unlatched it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, were the deeds. Original, signed transfers giving Thomas Sterling ownership of the massive Cole estate, along with signed confessions of embezzlement by Richard Cole. With this ledger and these deeds, Hannah didn't just have wealth. She had the power to completely destroy Adrian Cole. A manic, disbelieving laugh bubbled up in Hannah's chest. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt dangerous. She began shoving the gold certificates into the deep pockets of her heavy winter coat. She grabbed the ledger and the cedar box, tucking them securely under her arm. She couldn't carry the silver, but the cash and the documents were all she needed right now to secure a lawyer and get the hell out of Blackwood Cove. She turned back toward the tunnel, ready to climb up to the surface. Then she heard it. Thud. It was faint at first, muffled by the 30 feet of concrete and earth above her. But in the dead silence of the subterranean vault, it was unmistakable. Thud. Crack. Wood splintering. The sound of heavy boots, not just one pair, several. Hannah froze, the flashlight beam trembling against the concrete tunnel. "Spread out!" A gruff, muffled voice echoed down the vertical shaft. "Boss said she's probably squatting in the lobby. Grab her, throw her in her piece of crap car, and drag her out of town. He wants the demolition started tonight." Adrian hadn't waited for Friday. He hadn't waited for the legal eviction. He had sent his thugs under the cover of the winter night to forcefully remove her. Hannah killed her flashlight instantly, plunging the cavern back into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Hey!" another voice shouted from high above, right near the stage. "Look at this! The floorboards are ripped up!" Hannah's blood turned to ice. She hadn't closed the heavy steel hatch. She had left it wide open. "Bring a light over here," the first voice commanded. "There's a hole, and a ladder." Through the darkness, a faint, yellowish beam of light suddenly pierced the vertical shaft at the end of the tunnel, illuminating the iron rungs. "I'm going down," the voice echoed, dangerously loud now. Hannah backed away slowly, her boots shuffling silently on the dusty Persian rug. She was trapped. There was no other exit. She was 30 feet underground with millions of dollars, the darkest secret in Blackwood Cove, and a crew of violent men climbing down to find her. She looked at the rusted skeleton of Thomas Sterling in the pitch black. History was about to repeat itself in the dark, unless she fought back. Hannah pressed her back against the freezing, damp rock wall behind the Art Deco bar. She dragged her heavy coat tight around her body, trying to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her left arm clamped the leather ledger and the cedar box to her chest. Her right hand blindly groped the lower shelf of the bar until her fingers wrapped around the thick, dusty neck of a heavy glass bottle. The circle of yellowish light from the tunnel grew brighter. The heavy thud of boots hit the dirt floor of the vault. "Holy Mother of..." A gruff voice echoed through the subterranean room. Hannah peeked through a narrow gap between the mahogany bar and the wall. A massive man in a heavy Carhartt jacket stepped into the vault. His flashlight beam swept wildly across the room, illuminating the rotting velvet sofas, the faded Persian rug, and finally coming to rest on the desk. The man, Briggs, froze. The beam locked onto the skeleton of Thomas Sterling, highlighting the bullet hole right between the hollow eye sockets. "Cole!" Briggs yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Cole, get down here, right now!" "What is it?" A second voice echoed faintly from the vertical shaft. "Just get down here," Briggs shouted, his flashlight trembling slightly. He took a hesitant step toward the desk, keeping a wide berth. "Boss didn't say nothing about a dead body. This place is a tomb." As Briggs edged around the desk, his flashlight beam swept past the skeleton and hit the far wall. It caught the gleaming, oiled steel of the open Mosler safe. It caught the olive green canvas bags. And it caught the cascade of pristine, uncirculated silver dollars spilling onto the steel shelf. Briggs stopped breathing. The fear radiating from him vanished, instantly replaced by a predatory, consuming greed. He moved toward the safe like a man hypnotized. He holstered his flashlight under his armpit, reaching out with thick, calloused fingers to scoop up a handful of the heavy silver coins. They clinked together, a sharp, musical sound in the dead silence of the vault. "Jackpot," Briggs whispered reverently. He began shoving handfuls of the heavy coins into his deep jacket pockets. He forgot about the dead body. He forgot about his boss's orders. He entirely forgot to look for the homeless teenager he was sent to drag out. This was Hannah's only chance. She knew she couldn't overpower a man twice her size, but she was fast, and the vault was cloaked in pitch blackness everywhere outside the narrow beam of Briggs's flashlight. She slipped off her heavy winter boots. The freezing dirt bit into her socked feet, but she needed absolute silence. Holding her breath, she crept out from behind the bar. Briggs had his back to her, violently emptying the canvas bags, his pockets bulging and dragging his jacket down with the sheer weight of the silver. Hannah took one step, then another. She was halfway to the tunnel entrance when her foot brushed against something hard. Sterling's discarded fedora. It skidded across the dirt floor with a faint, dry scuff. Briggs spun around, the flashlight beam violently slicing through the dark. It hit Hannah perfectly, blinding her. She threw her arm up over her face, the heavy glass liquor bottle still gripped tightly in her hand. Well, well, Briggs sneered, his initial shock turning into a cruel, jagged smile. Look what the rat dragged in. You found the boss's little treasure room, didn't you, sweetheart? Give me the box. Stay back, Hannah warned, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. You're in way over your head, kid, Briggs laughed, taking a heavy step toward her. The silver in his pockets clinked loudly. Hand over the box and the book, and maybe I'll let you run off into the snow. Otherwise, I guess I'll just leave you down here with the other dead guy. He lunged. Hannah didn't back away. As Briggs reached for her, she dropped her center of gravity, gripping the heavy bottle of 1920s gin with both hands. She swung it upward with every ounce of desperate strength she had left. The thick glass connected squarely with Briggs's jaw. The bottle didn't shatter. It was solid, Prohibition-era glass, but the impact sounded like a baseball bat hitting a melon. Briggs let out a strangled grunt, his eyes rolling back. The sheer weight of the stolen silver in his pockets threw him off balance. He staggered backward, his boots catching on the edge of the rotting Persian rug, and collapsed heavily against the edge of the mahogany desk. His flashlight fell from his arm, clattering to the floor and rolling under the sofa, plunging the room into chaotic, dim shadows. Hannah didn't wait to see if he was getting up. She bolted. She sprinted barefoot into the pitch-black tunnel, her lungs burning with the smell of ozone and damp earth. She crashed into the wooden support beams, scraping her shoulders, but the adrenaline numbed the pain. She reached the bottom of the vertical shaft and threw the ledger, the cedar box, and the heavy bottle of gin into her deep coat pockets, freeing her hands. She gripped the freezing iron rungs of the ladder and began to climb. Briggs! What was that noise? Cole's voice drifted down the shaft. He was climbing down. Hannah looked up and saw the faint silhouette of a man blocking the dim light filtering down from the stage above. He was maybe 15 feet above her, descending slowly. Hannah grit her teeth. She couldn't go back down. Briggs was groaning, recovering in the vault below. She was trapped on a vertical axis. She climbed faster, closing the distance in the dark. Briggs! Cole called out again, his boot slipping slightly on a rung. Hannah reached his level. Cole looked down just as Hannah swung her arm through the rungs. She didn't try to punch him. She aimed for his grip. She slammed her fist onto his knuckles where they wrapped around the rusted iron. Cole shouted in surprise, his left hand instinctively letting go. What the? Hannah used the momentum to drive her knee upward, catching Cole hard in the thigh. He cursed, losing his footing on the slick, rusted metal. For a terrifying second, he hung by one hand, kicking wildly. Then, the rusted rung he was holding gave way with a sharp snap. Cole plummeted past her into the darkness, screaming until a sickening thud echoed from the bottom of the shaft, followed by a chorus of groans as he crashed directly into Briggs, who was just stumbling out of the tunnel. Hannah didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the remaining 20 feet, her bare feet bleeding and slipping, her muscles screaming in agony. She reached the top, grabbing the thick oak edge of the stage floor, and hauled herself out of the hole, rolling onto her back on the dusty floorboards. She lay there for a second, gasping for air, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. She had made it, but as she rolled over to stand up, the massive ballroom was suddenly flooded with blinding, searing white light. Hannah threw her hands over her eyes. 4 heavy-duty halogen work lights on tall tripods had been set up in a semicircle around the dance floor, cutting through the shadows and illuminating the rotting grandeur of the Starlight Pavilion. Standing in the center of the lights, flanked by 2 more men carrying heavy red plastic jerry cans, was Adrian Cole. He was wearing a perfectly tailored dark wool overcoat and a silk scarf, looking wildly out of place in the decaying ruin. The smug, dismissive sneer he usually wore was completely gone. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Adrian's eyes darted from Hannah's bleeding, barefooted form to the massive, open steel hatch behind her on the stage. "You found it," Adrian whispered. The words carried easily in the vast, silent room. Hannah pushed herself up to her knees, pulling the black leather ledger and the cedar box from her coat pockets. She held them up. "I found everything, Adrian," Hannah said, her voice shaking but loud. "I found Thomas Sterling. I found the bullet hole in his skull. And I found the ledger." Adrian closed his eyes for a brief second, releasing a long, trembling breath. When he opened them, the last shred of his polite businessman facade had burned away, leaving nothing but cold, ruthless desperation. "My grandfather was a great man," Adrian said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he began to pace the dance floor. "He built this town. He built the shipyards, the fisheries, the hospital. This entire pathetic county owes its existence to the Cole family. He built it on stolen money," Hannah yelled back, getting to her feet. She backed away toward the edge of the stage, putting distance between herself and the men below. "He was bankrupt. Thomas Sterling owned him, so he murdered him and stole the deeds back." "Sterling was a criminal, a parasite," Adrian snapped, pointing a gloved finger at her. "My grandfather did what he had to do to protect our legacy. For 90 years, that secret stayed buried right where it belonged. And then you, a piece of white trash with $10, had to stick your nose where it didn't belong. This isn't your land anymore, Adrian," Hannah said, holding the cedar box tight. "These are the original deeds, signed transfers. Sterling never filed them because your grandfather put a bullet in him, but they're legal. And this ledger is the proof. You don't own the Cole estate. Your family never did." Adrian stopped pacing. He looked at the 2 men standing beside him. He nodded once. The men immediately unscrewed the caps of the jerry cans and began splashing gasoline across the dry, rotting maple floorboards of the ballroom. The overpowering, noxious fumes instantly filled the freezing air, making Hannah choke. "What are you doing?" Hannah screamed, panic finally breaking through her bravado. "Gary from the zoning office already condemned the building," Adrian said smoothly, pulling a silver Zippo lighter from his coat pocket. "Such a tragic shame. A structural collapse, followed by an electrical fire. A homeless squatter trapped inside. A tragedy, really, but a fitting end for a town eyesore." "You can't do this!" Hannah yelled, looking frantically around the stage. The heavy velvet curtains were completely dry-rotted. The walls were century-old wood. The entire building was a massive tinderbox. "I can do whatever I want, Hannah," Adrian said, stepping closer to the stage, the gasoline soaking the floor mere feet from where she stood. "I am this town. The police work for me. The judges play golf with me. Do you really think anyone is going to investigate the ashes of a teenage vagrant? You don't exist." He flipped the lid of the Zippo. A bright orange flame flickered to life. "Drop the ledger and the box into the hole, Hannah," Adrian commanded. "Close the hatch, walk out the front door, get in your broken car, and never come back. That's your only way out of this." Hannah looked at the open hatch. She thought about the $12 in her pocket. She thought about freezing in her car, running from a world that had thrown her away. And then she looked at the ledger in her hands, the only thing that gave her power. The only thing that could make a man like Adrian Cole bleed. If she gave it to him, he would kill her anyway. He couldn't leave a witness. "No," Hannah said. Adrian sighed, a look of genuine disappointment crossing his face. A pity. He tossed the Zippo onto the soaked floorboards. The fire didn't just ignite, it exploded. A wall of blinding, roaring orange heat erupted across the ballroom floor, racing along the trails of gasoline and instantly catching the dry, rotted walls. The blast of heat hit Hannah like a physical blow, knocking her backward onto the stage. Within seconds, the grand ballroom of the Starlight Pavilion was a raging inferno. The smoke was thick, black, and suffocating. Adrian and his men were already sprinting for the front lobby doors, leaving her trapped on the elevated stage, surrounded by a rapidly closing ring of fire. The heat was absolute, an oppressive, physical weight that instantly blistered the exposed skin on Hannah's face and hands. The gasoline had acted as an accelerant, but the century-old dry-rotted maple of the Starlight Pavilion was the true fuel. Within 10 seconds, the entire front half of the ballroom was an impenetrable, roaring wall of orange and black. Hannah scrambled backward on the stage, coughing violently as the thick, acrid smoke banked against the vaulted ceiling and began rolling downward. She looked at the open steel hatch. Her first instinct was to dive back into the vault, but as she watched, the intense heat created a vacuum, sucking the black smoke directly down the vertical shaft. The tunnel was becoming a chimney. If she went down there, she wouldn't burn, but she would suffocate in minutes. She was trapped on an island of oak, the sea of fire rapidly chewing through the floorboards below her. "Think!" Hannah screamed to herself, the sound drowned out by the deafening crackle of burning timber. She looked frantically around the stage. The front doors were gone, completely obscured by the inferno. The dressing rooms to the right were already catching fire, the old plaster walls peeling and igniting. Then she looked up. Hanging 30 feet above the stage, partially obscured by the descending curtain of black smoke, was the old rigging system, a series of iron catwalks and thick hemp ropes used to lower backdrops and lighting during the pavilion's glory days. Behind the highest catwalk, near the apex of the vaulted ceiling, was a large circular ventilation window overlooking the ocean bluff. It was her only way out. Hannah shoved the cedar box and the black leather ledger deep into the inside breast pockets of her winter coat, zipping it up to her chin to protect them. She ran to the stage left wall, where a rusted iron ladder was bolted to the brick, leading up to the fly loft. She jumped, grabbing the lowest rung just as a section of the stage curtain ignited into a terrifying pillar of fire. The flames licked at her ankles as she hauled herself up. Her bare feet were bleeding and bruised from the subterranean tunnel, but she couldn't feel the pain. Adrenaline flooded her system, turning her terror into pure mechanical survival. She climbed 10 feet, 20 feet. The smoke was blinding now. Her eyes streamed with tears, and every breath felt like she was inhaling crushed glass. Crack. She looked down. The main structural beam supporting the dance floor had just snapped. The center of the ballroom collapsed violently into the basement, sending a massive plume of sparks and fiery debris spiraling up toward her. Hannah reached the narrow iron catwalk. It was maybe 2 feet wide, suspended precariously above the burning stage. The metal was already heating up, burning the soles of her feet through her socks. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling across the grated floor toward the back wall. Directly ahead was the ventilation window. It was covered in thick, wire-reinforced glass, clouded by decades of salt spray. Hannah reached the wall, pulling herself up. She wiped her tearing eyes, coughing so hard she tasted copper. She needed to break the glass, but she had dropped her heavy flashlight and the crowbar. She had nothing but her bare hands. Below her, the entire stage gave way. With a sickening, thunderous roar, the massive oak platform collapsed into the subterranean vault, taking the steel hatch, the rusted ladder, and the roaring fire down into Thomas Sterling's tomb. The entire building shuddered violently. The catwalk groaned. The bolts holding it to the brick wall were pulling loose. Hannah wrapped her heavy winter coat tightly around her right arm, bracing herself against the blistering brick wall. She pulled her arm back and drove her elbow into the center of the wire-reinforced glass with everything she had. The glass spiderwebbed, but didn't break. The impact sent a shockwave of agonizing pain up her arm, dislocating her shoulder. Hannah screamed, falling to her knees. The catwalk dropped several inches, hanging by a thread. She had seconds left. Refusing to die in this rotting monument to corruption, Hannah stood up, ignoring the blinding pain in her shoulder. She turned her back to the window, gripped the iron railing with her good arm, and kicked backward like a mule. Her heavy winter boot. Wait, she had taken her boots off in the vault. She was barefoot. Desperate, Hannah realized she had one heavy object left. She unzipped her coat, reached in, and pulled out the solid 24-carat gold pocket watch she had pried from Sterling's skeletal fingers. She wrapped the chain tightly around her knuckles, creating a heavy, solid gold brass knuckle. She turned, aimed for the weakened center of the spider-webbed glass, and punched it with all her might. The wire-reinforced glass shattered outward. A blast of freezing, agonizingly cold winter air rushed in, parting the smoke. Hannah didn't hesitate. As the catwalk finally ripped completely free from the wall, she dove headfirst through the jagged hole. She plummeted 15 feet into the freezing darkness, crashing violently into a massive snowdrift on the edge of the jagged ocean bluff. The snow cushioned her fall, but the impact knocked the wind completely out of her lungs. She rolled frantically away from the building, her bare feet kicking up clouds of white powder, dragging herself toward the tree line. She collapsed behind a massive pine tree just as the Starlight Pavilion finally surrendered. With a catastrophic explosion of sparks and structural timber, the massive roof caved in. A tower of flame shot 50 feet into the night sky, illuminating the churning Atlantic Ocean below in horrific, brilliant orange. Hannah lay in the snow, gasping, shaking uncontrollably from shock and the freezing temperatures. Through the trees, she saw Adrian Cole's Lincoln Navigator parked on the access road. Adrian was standing outside the vehicle, smoking a cigarette, watching the building burn to the ground. He looked completely relaxed, confident that the homeless teenager and his family's dirty secrets were currently turning to ash. He tossed his cigarette into the snow, got into his luxury SUV, and drove away. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut. He thought he had won. He thought she was dead. She patted her chest. The leather ledger and the cedar box were still there, safe beneath the thick insulation of her coat. She forced herself to stand. Her left shoulder was agonizingly dislocated. Her face was covered in soot and minor burns, and she was barefoot in a Maine blizzard. She knew she couldn't go to the Blackwood Cove police. Adrian owned them. She couldn't go to the local hospital. Adrian funded it. She had to get out of the county. Driven by pure, unadulterated spite, Hannah turned her back on the burning ruins and began to limp through the freezing woods, heading parallel to Route 1. It took her 3 agonizing hours to walk 4 miles. By the time she saw the glowing neon sign of a massive 24-hour truck stop outside the county limits, she was suffering from severe hypothermia. She stumbled through the glass doors, looking like a demon crawled straight out of a fire pit. A massive, bearded trucker sitting in a booth dropped his coffee mug. "Sweet Jesus, kid," the trucker gasped, rushing over to her. "Are you all right? Who did this to you?" Hannah looked up at him, her lips blue, her eyes burning with a terrifying singular focus. "I need a ride to the FBI field office in Augusta," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Right now." The morning sun over Augusta, Maine, was blindingly bright, reflecting off the snow-covered streets. Inside the heavily secured interview room of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the atmosphere was dead silent. Special Agent Harrison Caldwell stared at the items spread across the stainless steel table. There was a heavy, soot-stained cedar box. Inside were 4 perfectly preserved, original property deeds, transferring ownership of the entire Blackwood Cove coastal bluff, including the town centre, the shipyards, and the coal estate, to one Thomas Sterling. Alongside them were 3 signed, notarized confessions of bank fraud and embezzlement by Richard Cole. Next to the box sat the black leather ledger, open to the final entries detailing the impending confrontation that led to a murder. And finally, stacked neatly beside the ledger, were 50 Series 1928 gold certificates, totaling over $10,000 in face value, and a solid gold, dented pocket watch. Caldwell looked up at the 19-year-old girl sitting across from him. Hannah was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her left arm secured in a sling, her face cleaned but heavily bandaged where the heat had blistered her skin. "You're telling me," Caldwell started, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off a massive headache, "that you bought a condemned dance hall for $10 at a public auction, and within a week you uncovered a Prohibition-era mob execution, a hidden vault containing millions in silver, and the evidence that the wealthiest family in coastal Maine built their empire on stolen land and murder?" "Yes," Hannah said, her voice steady and raspy, "and Adrian Cole intentionally set the building on fire, with you inside, to destroy this evidence. He didn't know I took the documents out of the safe. He thought they'd burn with me." Hannah leaned forward, tapping the ledger with her good hand. "You can check the zoning office. Adrian brought Gary, the town inspector, to harass me. He sent 3 men to drag me out. One of them is named Briggs. I think he might be dead at the bottom of the vault, unless the fire got to him first." Agent Caldwell let out a long breath. He picked up his desk phone. "Get me the U.S. attorney and call the state police barracks. I want a fleet of tactical units ready to roll into Blackwood Cove in 20 minutes. Nobody goes near the local PD. We're doing this unilaterally." The raid happened at noon. Adrian Cole was hosting a luncheon at the country club, entertaining out-of-state developers to brag about the tragic but convenient clearing of the Starlight property, readying it for a luxury resort. He was mid-toast when 6 black Suburbans tore across the manicured 18th green. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the dining room. Adrian's smug smile vanished the moment he saw Agent Caldwell walk through the doors. But the true crushing blow came when Caldwell stepped aside, revealing Hannah Jenkins walking in behind him. She looked battered, bruised, and exhausted, but she was alive. Adrian dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, a perfect parallel to his life in that exact second. "Adrian Cole," Caldwell announced, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "You are under arrest for arson, attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, which I highly suggest you use, considering we've already secured the ledger and the deeds." Adrian lunged forward, his face purple with rage, completely abandoning his sophisticated facade. "She's lying! She's a vagrant! A thief!" 2 agents tackled him to the marble floor, driving a knee into his back and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Adrian thrashed wildly, screaming as he was dragged out of the club in front of all his wealthy peers. Hannah stood there and watched him go. The terror that had gripped her for the past week completely evaporated. The fallout was catastrophic and heavily publicized. The excavation of the Starlight Pavilion ruins, aided by federal investigators, uncovered exactly what Hannah said it would. Beneath the charred debris, sealed in the reinforced concrete vault, they found the millions in silver, the remains of Thomas Sterling, and the battered bodies of Adrian's 2 thugs, who had barely survived the fire, only to be arrested upon rescue. The legal battle over the Cole estate was the largest in Maine's history. Because Adrian's grandfather had murdered Sterling to prevent the filing of the deeds, the courts eventually ruled that the Cole family had been illegally occupying and profiting from the land for nearly a century. Through an incredibly complex legal settlement, the state seized the Cole assets to pay off historical restitution. But as the legal owner of the Starlight property, and the one who unearthed the legal documents, Hannah was awarded a staggering percentage of the recovered silver, the pristine gold certificates, and a massive settlement from the Cole estate's frozen accounts. 6 months later, Hannah sat in a plush leather chair in a high-rise law office in Boston. Her phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was a text from David, her ex-fiancé. Since her face had been splashed across national news, he had been desperately trying to contact her, claiming he made a terrible mistake, and wanted to explain why he stole her savings. Hannah didn't even read the full message. She deleted his contact, blocked the number, and dropped the phone into her designer purse. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. She was 20 years old. She was a multi-millionaire. But more importantly, she was unbreakable. The girl who had shivered in a broken-down Ford Escort was dead, burned to ash in the fire of the Starlight Pavilion. She signed the final settlement papers, stood up, and walked out of the office. She had a flight to catch. She was going to travel the world, and she was never going to be cold again. If Hannah's incredible journey from freezing in a broken-down car to bringing down a corrupt, century-old dynasty kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. This story proves that the darkest secrets can't stay buried forever, and sometimes the most underestimated people hold the power to change everything. What would you have done if you found that vault? Would you have taken the silver and run, or stayed to fight like Hannah? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your escape plans. Don't forget to share this wild true crime drama with your friends, and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling, real-life mystery stories. We've got more insane hidden treasure and survival stories coming your way every single week. Stay curious, stay brave, and I'll see you in the next video.